All right, so we're back. This way I can go through this fairly carefully. All right, so I mentioned earlier that methylphenidate blocks the reuptake of both dopamine and norepinephrine. So, since both are being increased, uh, we don't know if it's due to either of those, norepinephrine or dopamine or both. So, we're gonna to look at that. We're gonna use two other drugs that are more selective. So atomoxetine, that's spelled wrong. I've been having a hard time with that. Atomoxetine, also known as Strattera, which is also used to treat ADHD, is a non-stimulant norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, or a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, SNRI. GBR 12909 is a selective dopamine reuptake inhibitor. Okay? So what these are doing is working on the reuptake process. If you selectively prevent the reuptake of norepinephrine, so you increase the synaptic levels of just norepinephrine and not dopamine, you see a reduction in pinning, just like methylphenidate. If you give GBR 12909, so now what you're doing is you're selectively increasing the synaptic levels of just dopamine, then what you get is no effect. I mean, there's a little bit of a downward trend there, but it's not significant, and that's a fairly high dose. So this suggests that methylphenidate is probably reducing play through a noradrenergic or norepinephrine system by increasing the circulating levels of norepinephrine, or the synaptic levels, of norepinephrine. Okay, so now the next step is, okay, if that's what's happening, if we know that it's norepinephrine, let's try to puzzle through which receptor it is. So we already mentioned that norepinephrine binds to two families of receptor, the alpha family and the beta family. We have alpha 1 and alpha 2, they do different things. We also have beta 1 and beta 2, but in the brain there's not a huge distinction between those, so they're not going to really try to differentiate between them. But in the brain, alpha 1 and alpha 2 are located in different places, so what they're going to try to do is try to see whether or not they can block the effects of methylphenidate by combining an antagonist at a postsynaptic receptor. So they're going to combine methylphenidate with prazosin, or combine methylphenidate with RX-8210002, or combine methylphenidate with propranolol. So the idea here is that we know that methylphenidate increases synaptic levels of norepinephrine, which is going to be binding to these receptors. If it's due to one of these receptors, then you should be able to block the effect of methylphenidate on play. Okay? All right, so here are the three drugs. And if we look at this one, first of all, this is where the drugs are working down here at their postsynaptic receptor. Well, let's look at RX. This is an alpha 2 antagonist. Here's saline. That's where they are to begin with, saline. This is the first injection, second injection. You give them methylphenidate, which is the MP. You see play goes down. RX by itself has no effect on play, but when you combine RX with methylphenidate, it blocks this effect. So it reverses the effects of methylphenidate on play. When you test methylphenidate with the alpha 1 antagonist, prazosin, you don't see that. Vehicle, methylphenidate reduces play. Prazosin by itself doesn't have an effect. Prazosin with methylphenidate, basically the same as methylphenidate by itself. So methylphenidate is acting on, or at least in terms of play, is increasing levels of norepinephrine in synapses if it happens to hit an alpha-1 receptor, that doesn't do anything for the play. And you see the same thing for propranolol. So what this suggests is that what methylphenidate is doing is, one, increasing the release of increasing synaptic levels of norepinephrine, and norepinephrine acting at alpha-2 receptors results in a reduction in play. Okay? Finally, the last piece of evidence here is what they wanted to do. So that was pretty good. And in fact, most people would have stopped there, but they thought, okay, if that's the case, then if you can give a sub-effective dose of both atomoxetine, ATM, and methylphenidate together, they should add together and reduce play. So that's what they did. Same design as before. Here's your double control. Atomoxetine by itself doesn't have an effect. Methylphenidate by itself did not have an effect. Now remember, these are lower doses. These are doses that they knew from their earlier work would not impact play. But when you combine this sub-effective dose with this sub-effective dose, they kind of add together, bam, you see a reduction in play. That pretty much puts the nail in the coffin. Okay, so if we look at the summary of their findings, is the magnitude of suppression dose-dependent? You betcha. Is the route of administration important? Not really. So the stuff that we're seeing with rats, it's not an artifact of injecting them as opposed to giving them a pill. And finally, does it do it through norepinephrine or dopamine mechanism? And it's a norepinephrine mechanism. Okay, let me just go through here. What else do I got here? So let me just finish this off with a kind of where we started, kind of. So if we look at opioids, endocannabinoids here, so when we did the feeding, we know that opioids increase feeding, it increases taste reactivity, and we know it also increases playfulness. Endocannabinoids increases feeding, increases taste reactivity, and also increases playfulness. So it looks like these two transmitter systems are acting in very similar ways in both of these motivated behaviors, whether it be feeding or whether it be play. Now, there's obviously going to be differences because they're different things. They're different behaviors, but at some level, it's acting on the bigger picture in the same way. Okay, back to dopamine and norepinephrine. Yeah, not very straightforward. But we do know from feeding that it does increase incentive salience and doesn't have any effect on taste reactivity. So what we're going to do next is we're going to look at whether or not these three, if we use a model similar to what Barrage might have been doing with being able to get a sense for incentive motivation, maybe incentive salience, looking at the motivation to seek out the behavior, will we begin to see a differentiation just like Barrage did with feeding and taste reactivity? And in terms of norepinephrine, yeah, this is more in the cognitive domain, it seems. One of the ideas is that this is interfering with, whenever you take something like ritalin, it allows you to focus. It allows you to not be distracted by irrelevant stimuli in the environment, which when you're playing, that's kind of what you do. You're just sort of distracted. And so by ramping that up, that cognitive awareness, that cognitive attunement, you tend to be less playful. Okay, so that's it. In class, we're going to pick this up and we'll look at, we'll just look at that. Okay, sorry. Whew.